Hi, my name is Brian Patrick. I'm the Director of Business Operations for Great Falls Public Schools, and I'm going to do a presentation on how schools are funded. Schools are funding the power to fund schools comes from the Constitution of the state of Montana. It's the goal of the people to establish a system of education which will develop the full educational potential of each person. So how does that happen? That responsibility is designated to the legislature, which is in a picture of that is in the upper left-hand corner of this screen. If you move to the right, there are about 400 school districts in the state of Montana. Great Falls has two, an elementary district and a high school district, and probably every town you drive through in the state of Montana as you travel has a school district. If we go below the state of Montana, you'll find that there's two pictures. One is of Great Falls High, another was a small elementary school, let's say Ulm. And when the legislature has to design a system for funding in the schools of Montana, they have to create a balance between the very large schools and the very small schools. As we look at the rest of the picture, below the legislative picture of our capital, there's a dollar sign. And know that probably since 1989, the state's been rich. They've had a lot of money. For example, when the oil boom hit eastern Montana, to being very poor when the fires hit our state a few years back. And during the course of time since 1989, both the Democrats and Republicans have controlled all aspects of the House, from the House of Representatives to the Senate to the governorship. Other important factors, if we see the voter at the bottom center of the screen, the voter is important because they have a choice in funding schools. Each May, the trustees have the ability to ask for a levy, and voters can say yes or no to that. The voters also choose who goes to the legislature, as well as the table with all the people around it that represents the Board of Trustees. And the Board of Trustees also has power in funding schools and saying, do we want to run a levy or not? And in the very center, you see the scales of justice, which have a big impact on the funding of the state of Montana, which we'll see here in a second. So the school funding goes back to 1989. That was our centennial. And at the time, and you'll see in a minute too why this is important, but at the time Microsoft Office Suite came out, and it includes spreadsheets, word processing, database, and presentation software. The interest rates at the time were 10.5%, and inflation was at 4.83%. And if we compare to today, 10.5% may seem quite high. I know I began my career as a teacher in 1982 and bought a car, and I paid 18%. So at the time, 10.5% seemed pretty good. Some things that were going on in the world were the Berlin Wall was being dismantled. Just a general picture of what was happening in the world as well as the state of Montana by some of the information provided here. So in 1989, it's a key year for funding in school in the state of Montana, and that has to do with this picture where you see numbers on a page, and they represent amount spent per student, and that's just for demonstration purposes. But we had school districts in the state that were very rich. At the top of the screen, you can see spent $8,267 per student, $10,500 per student, $12,400. These schools had everything. They had brand new computer labs, Greyhound buses, curriculum was updated. They paid their teachers very well. These schools did quite well when it came to student education. If you go to the bottom of the screen, there's some schools that paid, let's say, $4,235 per student, $4,325, all the way down to $2,754. These schools were not in very good shape. Their curriculum was outdated, teacher pay was very low, and what happened, I think, at the time was that parents and schools that were in this category, and parents mainly said, okay, when my student goes to college and they have to compete with a student from a district that spends a lot more per student, and those students have had the ability to understand Microsoft Works and Microsoft Office, and they've had the computer labs, they've had all their experience when our students haven't even seen a computer. So they initiated a lawsuit against the state of Montana and said something needs to be done to equalize funding in the state. And if you look at the lower left-hand corner, again, it's legislative power to fund schools, and the courts directed them to change the system of funding for education in the state of Montana. So the first step in that for the legislature is they said, what's the average? What if we take all the high spending schools and the low spending schools, let's come up with an average and find what that is. And if you look at the picture, there's an 80% of average, which became known as the base. So the lower line, the arrow that's at the bottom of the screen that points up, that lower line became the average. Okay, now not all schools could be at the average, and they thought we better create an area of growth of 20% where local communities can be involved and support their schools. So the state would fund all schools up to the average, up to 80%, and then local communities would be required to, not required to, would have the ability to provide additional funding for schools to a limit. The limit is they couldn't go above the maximum budget or the 100%. So at the time, the schools that were above that line had to decrease their budgets to get down to 100% or lower. The schools that were below the line, at the very bottom of this chart, had to increase their budgets to get to 80%. There was a 3-year time period where that happened. So the goal was to get all schools between the base and the maximum budget. Just as a recap, the state provides 80% of the funding for every school in the state of Montana by formula, and then 20% comes on the back or is the purview of the local voters who can increase the average up to the maximum amount allowed, which is 100%. And they do that every May. There's a mill levy that the trustees have the option to participate in, and provides the 20% to get to the 100% maximum budget. This is what it looks like for Great Falls High School. The yellow part of this chart is state funding. You can see all the different categories of state funding, everything with the largest being direct state aid. That includes enrollment numbers of students, as well as part of the formula provides a funding for a high school, $353,000, a middle school, $117,000, and elementary, $58,000. You can see at the bottom of the chart, there's an arrow that shows quality educator. This was added later. It's an amount that for every teacher that's in the district, they get a certain amount of money, and for our high school district, that amounts to $864,734. The gray area, the funding formula on the chart, covers something called guaranteed tax base, and a part of the formula also is local based property taxes. And very simply put is that when they looked at funding between rich districts and poor districts, rich districts could afford to pay more to get to the base budget. Poor districts needed help. In this formula for Great Falls High School, guaranteed tax base, this money comes from the state at $6.6 million, and our local property taxpayers pay $2.3 million, which gets us up to the 80%. And finally, the last part of the chart that I want to highlight is the red section, and that's where our local property taxpayers come in and our trustees. Over the course of time, since 1989, our local property taxpayers have voted permanent levies of $4.4 million, and that supports the amount over base. You can see just to the left of that arrow, we're at 96.4% of maximum budget. If we were to be at the maximum budget, our budget would be $27,650,879. Our current budget for 24-25 is $26,712,778, which means that our voters could vote an additional $938,000 worth of support for our schools. How important is student enrollment? We saw the picture before that had all the lines that pointed at the funding components, but student numbers account for 81.3% of our funding for schools. The basic entitlement is 8.3%. That includes having a school building and the payments that we get for that. Quality educators, the very bottom of the last screen, was 3.6%. 5.4% of our budget comes from special education, and other state elements is about 1.4%. So this really highlights that student enrollment is super important when it comes to funding schools. This slide demonstrates how much, what our enrollment has been over time. And our enrollment, if we go back to 2008, 2009, was 10,410 students. This last year, in 23-24, our enrollment was 10,352 students. This shows a pretty consistent pattern of actual numbers of students in our district, although when you look at the charts, you can see that the elementary has had some growth from 2008, 2009, up through about 2015-16, and then a few declines, another year of growth, and then declines. Middle school has been pretty flat. You can see some growth in 2017, starting in 17-18, up to about 2021, and that's a matter of those higher numbers in the elementary just moving from grade to grade and hitting middle school. And then high school, during the same time period, saw a steep decline from 2008 through 2018, and then again, you can see the elementary numbers starting to matriculate into the high school from there up until 2022. How important is student enrollment? Well, when we look at our budget, and this is a diagram that our district uses to project where we'll stand for the budget for the next year. On the left, the 2022-23 budget projections. The top line is revenue estimates. The bottom three squares are needs estimates. And our revenue estimates start with the current budget. We project what additional state funding will be, gives us a new budget authority for the next year. Need estimates at the bottom start again with our existing budget, and then we estimate what's it going to cost, what increased costs will there be for our budget for the next year. These are everything from increases in health insurance to staff salary increases and anything else. The difference between those two lines is either a positive or a negative. And in 22-23, we saw a positive of $10,368 on a $77 million budget. And that year, we grew by 123 students. That meant an additional $2,059,000 from the state. The very next year, or the year before that, in 21-22, we saw a reduction of 82 students. 82 students less came into our district. With that, there was an increase because of inflationary increases of almost $750,000. So the difference between the revenues and the need estimates was a minus $1.1 million. On the far right of this screen, you can see a 100 student increase means about $1.6 million for our district, and a 100 student decrease means an increase of $912,000. You might say, if it's a 100 student increase, why wouldn't it be the same as a 100 student decrease? That's a very good question. The reason is one of the funding components has to do with students that are declining in enrollment can use a 3-year average versus their actual enrollment. So you can imagine if you lost 100 students, if you use a 3-year average, in figuring the budget, you'd only lose about 66 students versus the whole 100. Is annual inflation important? It definitely is. You can see by the left the amount of inflation that the state provided the funding components. In 2017, it was 1.79%, 2018, 0.5%. And down to 2023, it increased to 2.57%. In 2024, it was 2.7%. In 2025, it was 3%. The state law has a maximum that says that school inflation cannot increase more than 3%. So if inflation were to grow by 6%, unless the law changed, the maximum amount the state could provide is 3%. In 23-24, we had an example to show exactly how much inflation impacts our budget. 2.7% inflation meant an additional $1.7 million to our budget. So very huge in funding schools across the state of Montana. I want to talk for a minute about when we negotiate with our staff, what impact does that have on the budget? So one of the things we do, there's 6 major bargaining units that represent most of our employees. A 1%, if every staff member in our district received a 1% increase, that would mean an additional $703,000 of impact to the next year's budget. It's important to note that salaries and benefits, that includes insurance, equate to about 84% of our general fund budget. And it's important to understand in this time frame that we're in right now, our goal is to attract and retain high quality staff. And part of the way we attract teachers is the pay that we give them. Part of the way that we retain teachers is the pay that they make working for our district. And we're in a time when there's a lot of shortages for staffing, where we compete with schools that provide 4-day weeks for their staff, and pay is a super important part of keeping people here in Great Falls, and their ability to find a place to live and to pay for their living arrangements. So if I'm looking at the 24-25 budget projection, again, state and local money, starting budget from, or ending budget from last year was $79,365,000. Additional state funding was about $1.5 million, leaves us a new budget authority for operating the district at $80,934,000. Needs estimates, again, we start with the existing budget from the previous year, $79,365,000, and then look at things like contractual obligations. What increases are there with steps and lanes and negotiated increases, insurance increases? We identified $4.2 million of additional expenses that would be incurred for the upcoming school year. Gave a needs estimate budget of $83 million, just under $600,000. So the difference between those two was $2.6 million. From the previous year, we were able to use ESSER money in a way that we could use it for this year, and we banked about $5 million, so we were roughly $2.5 million we could apply to the budget for 24-25. Now this chart has a lot of information on it, but what it does, it breaks down for each year the state revenues, state expenses, and the difference between the two. And the next column in the peach color is state inflation rate, and then actual inflation rate is the impact in cash that has had on the district. The green section is negotiated increases for teachers and administrators, and then the light green section reviews whether or not we had a levy and it passed. The vote difference is if there were more yes votes in the elementary in this year. In 14-15, there were 1,695 more yes votes and no votes. High school, 1,753 more votes. And then the enrollment, which really drives our funding, and during that year was 10,331 students. So this breaks it down year by year from 2014-15 through 24-25. A couple things are highlighted, and you can see the section in yellow on the left, partway down, that starts with 327,000, 510,000, 446,000. These were the years that we were doing a lot of bond projects in the district. And because of the bond projects, there was a lot of money in our budget that was not spent for the general maintenance. There was not time to add a new boiler, add a new roof, those types of things. And the bond projects were taking care of that. So in 2017, we can see the state revenues were $328,000 roughly. Our expenses for the year were projected to be about $1.8 million, so a difference of $1.5 million. That was covered by projects that were planned for that would have been done but didn't need to be done. So 3 years of bond projects, you can see from 2017 through 2020, helped us balance the budget. And then in 2020-21 school year, you can see it's rose colored. And again, revenues versus expenses didn't pencil out very well. In 2020, 2021, we were about $500,000 short. The federal money that came in to help us deal with the pandemic made up the difference for those years from 2020-21 through 2024-25. My concern as a business manager is if the amount has grown, the difference amount has grown, which I'll show on the next slide, is that if we look at the yellow years and the ESSER years, the difference between revenues and expenses are demonstrated by the chart to the right. And this is on a $81 million budget for 24-25. But for 24-25, we were about $2.66 million short in looking at the difference between our revenues and expenses. That's a growing trend, and it can't operate that for very long without really impacting the district. And it's important to understand too that as we look at our budget, 86% or 84% of it has to do with salary and benefits. And from 23-24, 24-25, in trying to attract and retain staff, we gave 4% salary increases. Next slide just shows from 2008, 2009 through 2020-21, we went through a period of time where we made a lot of reductions in order to meet the budget. You can see the green section on the left-hand side is our revenues, how we balanced the budget. In 2008-29, we made $2.6 million worth of cuts to our district. That included 2 elementary teachers and 7 high school teachers. In 2009-2010, we used $1.5 million of reserves and made reductions of $614,000. And you can see year by year, whether we had a levy, like in 2014-15, we ran a levy and it passed for $1.6 million. And then during that year, we did not use any reserves or make any reductions. And then in 2020-2021, we ran a levy for $1.75 million and it passed. But you can see over the time, we had levies of $3.3 million during that time period. We used $5 million in reserves and made reductions of almost $10.5 million in order to make the budget match up each year. During the course of that time, 18 teachers were cut in the elementary, 15 in the high school, and 67.5 teachers in the high school were reduced. So for a total of 101 teachers from 2008, 2009 through 2020, 2021 were reduced. On the right-hand side of the screen, we also didn't just cut teachers, we reduced programs. So the elementary is represented by the yellow section, and one of the big programs that was cut during this time period was environmental education program. We reduced our summer school, eliminated summer school in a lot of cases, eliminated professional development. You can see in the peach section is our middle school. Again, summer school programs, equipment and supply budgets were reduced. In the high school, again, summer school programs were reduced. We eliminated a lot of programs, including professional development and travel for our teachers, as well as in-service training. And then district-wide, we did reduce a lot of leadership positions, like our athletic director salary was reduced. A lot of administrative positions were combined. One cabinet level position did the work of two cabinet level positions from before. And then the far right column just talks about shifts that we made, that maybe we use federal money instead of general fund budget money to make that. All this information and a lot more can be found in annually our district creates district budget information that includes description of all our budgeted funds, facilities information, federal programs, history of school finance laws. Every 2 years, the legislature changes the school funding formula a little bit, and it goes through every session, what happened to school funding and the impacts that it had for schools. If you have any questions, feel free to call me, Brian Patrick. My contact information there, and I'd really encourage you to access this book. It's located on our webpage. There's a QR code at the bottom of the screen that you can click on, and it has a wealth of information about our district financially, and just general information on age of our buildings, to a number of things like that. So I thank you for your time today, and appreciate you listening to this presentation.